to the extent that Kautsky influences segments of the left in the US and internationally, it's worth looking at him. But it's also worth doing it so we can reject him. Because those politics will not get you to socialism and then not get you to communism, and they will end up in betrayal in one form or another.
Welcome to All That's Left, a podcast from Left Voice. My name is Oden. On today's episode, we're going back in history, but to a topic that, as we'll see, still holds relevance for the present day. And the person at the center of that topic is Karl Kautsky. Today I'm joined by independent communist historian and three-time podcast guest, Doug Greene, to discuss his latest book, Renegade's Revenge, The New Reformism and the Revival of Karl Kautsky. So, who was Karl Kautsky? Kautsky was a theorist of the SPD, the German Social Democratic Party, which was the largest party in the Second International. And he was immensely influential at the height of the Second International. In fact, because of how he popularized Marxist ideas, Kautsky was recognized as the quote-unquote Pope of Marxism. In the earlier part of his life, so in the early 20th century, the major socialist figures of the time, people like Rosa Luxemburg, Lenin, Trotsky, Eugene Debs, they all looked to Kautsky for guidance. But despite his radical rhetoric, Kautsky's Marxism was limited. At almost every pivotal moment, when it really counted, he stood with the reformists rather than for proletarian revolution. For example, he defended the SPD's support for German imperialism in World War I. He was staunchly against Bolshevism. Until the end of his life, he was absolutely wedded to bourgeois democracy and parliamentarism. And importantly, every time his ideas were tried, they didn't lead to socialism, they led to defeat. As Doug writes, Kautsky's final legacy was in providing a left cover for imperialist war and anti-communist socialism, made safe for bourgeois liberalism. So, why talk about Kautsky? What lessons does this history hold for today? Well, in recent years, there has been a resurgence of interest in Kautsky on the left, particularly in the United States. So, many US leftists have used Kautsky's arguments to defend working within, for example, the Democratic Party. These leftists embrace the same underlying reformism as Kautsky, with, for example, their faith in the institutions of capitalist democracy. This is why modern reformists are destined to, as Doug writes, find themselves in the same cul-de-sac as Kautsky himself. So in that sense, this conversation is not just about Karl Kautsky the individual, or about the attempted revival of Kautskyism. Doug's book certainly refutes Kautskyism, but in the process, the book and this conversation elucidate revolutionary Marxism. And it shows us that if we're serious about fighting capitalism, we need to leave Kautsky and his politics in the dustbin of history while returning to revolutionary socialism. Doug is also the author of A Failure of Vision, Michael Harrington and the Limits of Democratic Socialism, as well as Stalinism and the Dialectics of Saturn, which I have interviewed him about on this very podcast, so I will link to those episodes in the show notes. He has also written Communist Insurgent, Blanqui's Politics of Revolution. As he describes at the end of the episode, he has two forthcoming books, one devoted to refuting neo-Stalinist conspiracism on the Moscow trials, and another about the connections between the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, Benito Mussolini, and fascism. I'll link to these works and Doug's articles on Karl Kautsky in the show notes. Here's my interview with Doug. Doug, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
So the first part of your book is about Karl Kautsky's life and ideas, and you start with when he was on the left of the SPD, or the German Social Democratic Party, in the early 20th century in particular. I think this is also a good place to start a conversation today. So, I want to start with kind of a basic question of who was Karl Kautsky and what influential ideas did he espouse at the time? In particular, I mean, why was he known as the Pope of Marxism?
Well, Karl Kautsky was the preeminent socialist theorist in German social democracy and the Second International, which was the European organization for socialist parties. And if you were a socialist of pretty much any sort in Europe or the United States, you were reading Karl Kautsky. And to give you some examples, Eugene V. Debs, the famous American socialist, when he became a socialist after the Pullman strike of 1894, he read in prison a number of works, some of which were Karl Kautsky. Rosa Luxemburg read him. Lenin, Trotsky, Plekhanov, the Italians, the Spanish, the French, they were all reading him. Basically, what he did is he popularized a lot of Marxist ideas in a book called The Economic Doctrines of Karl Marx, which is about Das Kapital. And probably even more famously is he wrote the Erfurt Program, which was the German Social Democratic Party's political program. And in a very concise manner, I might add, he talked about, how they viewed, class society, the role of the working class, the party, and the future they hoped to build. And that it was very attractive because it was a good popularization of these ideas for a whole generation of leftists, of workers, and socialists who were reading it. So he wasn't just a popularizer, although that was a significant part of what he was doing, but particularly as he had this idea that capitalism would inevitably, by design, collapse, and social democracy would pick up the reins and would usher in a socialist future. And at first, he kind of presents this as orthodox Marxism. Later, he develops this into a full-blown strategy where they could democratically transform the existing system into socialism. And Kautsky, if nothing else, was very consistent on his point. It became like it really kind of took over his politics by the end of his life. But until 1914, all sections of socialism looked to Karl Kautsky as the figure, who best espoused the politics of Marx, Engels, and revolution. But I'm certain we'll get into this, but that became less tenable after 1914.
So we've talked about Kautsky on the left and how influential he was among socialists, leftists, and workers at the time. You then, in your book, describe Kautsky's shift to the center and eventually basically to the right of the SPD. Obviously, as you describe, certainly the seeds were already there for this shift. But what exactly was Kautsky's worldview, and what were the beliefs that led him gradually rightward? And how was this worldview manifested in his stances toward, for example, World War I, imperialism?
I think I'll start with what truly prevented him from being, full-blown Marxist, leftist. And this almost sounds cliche, but I earnestly believe it, is I don't think he was ever properly Hegelian, properly philosophical, properly Spinozist. And this comes to something he actually admitted himself is how he came to Marx. He actually says later in life, I came to Marx through Darwin, through the theory of evolution, and this whole evolutionary conception of like a gradualist transition to socialism is something that is ingrained in his Marxism. And it becomes more pronounced later on, and it influences how he responds to a lot of debates. So when there's, for instance, when there's the revisionist controversy with Edward Bernstein, who's like, we got to ditch Marxism, Hegel, the class struggle, the dialectic. Kautsky defends orthodox Marxism, but he does so in a very peculiar sort of way. He'll defend, that we need revolution, that the contradictions are sharpening, but he won't defend Marxist philosophy. And that's very different from people like Lenin or Plekhanov, who are like, they're like, no, we have to defend these philosophical foundations. And even when he writes on Marx's Capital, which is, I think, actually one of his better books, I might add, is he doesn't talk about the dialectic. He doesn't talk about, contradictions, really. And I think that was always a weakness in him, because Hegelian Marxism, or just Marxism, we have this idea of, contradictions, dialectics, that like essentially the contradictions become so sharp, that there's this massive, explosive, revolutionary change. And Kautsky doesn't really have that in his Marxism at all. And it was George Lukács who actually said during the revisionist controversy that a defense of Hegel was like part of the anti-revisionist defense of Marxism. And I think he was correct. So instead of having a revolutionary dialectical conception of Marxism, is he has this evolutionary things will gradually happen. The contradictions will slowly accumulate, and eventually, in a way that it's very unclear to me, we will get socialism. He's also influenced by positive ideas, Auguste Comte, I probably didn't pronounce that right, but all like these kind of evolutionary gradualistic approaches. And that really goes into a lot of the weaknesses of his Marxism, philosophically. Now, politically, it's a little different because at first he really has what I would call a fairly orthodox Marxist view. So in the 1880s, he's a central figure in the exiled portion of the Social Democratic Party because it's banned in Germany for like 10 years or so. And he actually says, we'll never get to power through elections at all. He basically says, we need to smash the state. It's only going to be like basically a violent revolution. Now, eventually, the Social Democratic Party gets legalized. And in the Erfurt program, he kind of leaves out the hope that we don't need to agitate for a republic, that we can gain a majority and change things. And the Erfurt program does something very peculiar. On the one hand, it says social democracy is fighting for a communist future. So they have the revolutionary goal. It's uniting all the militants. But on the other hand, he's also saying the day-to-day, which is what we should focus on. This is what he says. It's reforms, this gradualist stuff. So there's this disconnect. And as long as people are willing to live with the disconnect, you can be a reformist in practice, but in theory, you can claim to be a revolutionary, which is what he's doing. And, there are people at the time who in the SPD are like, we really can't espouse this kind of parliamentarism. And Kautsky's like, no, we're still revolutionary. We're just building our forces gradually. And, for the 1890s and into the early part of the 20th century, that's really a lot of people in the party accept that. They don't question it, even the people on the left of the party. But as struggle kind of heats up in Germany when they have like debating the mass strike in 1905 and later in like 1910, and particularly on questions of imperialism, Kautsky's never willing to challenge this strategy. He's like, we got to stick to the tried and true method, just keep voting for Social Democrats, building up our forces, building up our apparatus. Eventually we'll have a parliamentary majority and we can, usher in socialism. And as time goes on, like the party really starts to fracture. You have the revisionists on the right who basically like, we really want to ditch all this. And you have the development on the left of people like Luxemburg, Liebknecht, among others, who are really pushing for mass action, organizing the workers, not just engaging in electoral politics. And Kautsky's in the middle, just trying to stick with his tried and true method. And ultimately, it's kind of like it means because he's so fixated on this method of tried and true, of building up your forces, it means he doesn't want to engage in anti-imperialist agitation. Or he doesn't want to like mobilize the workers against the Kaiser. He can claim it's a revolutionary approach, what he's doing, but in reality, even if he is denying it, is he's blocking with the right-wing elements of the party bureaucracy against the revolutionary left, against the working class. And when the Social Democrats eventually vote for World War I, it kind of blows up that whole conception. It's like, and he actually kind of admits, like, what else were we supposed to do? We just had to vote for it. Obviously in a defensive war to, gain colonies and slaves and all that kind of stuff. But it's like he admits, like, we couldn't do anything else. Like, in all that time, and he actually had written on imperialism, he never considered, maybe doing general strikes or not actually voting for war. That kind of element of Kautsky, the Darwinism, the evolutionary, the parliamentarism, a lot of it was there early on, but it becomes far more pronounced as you get into the 20th century. And by the time you get to World War I, it's very clearly what side he's on. It's not on the side of the revolution.
Yeah, I'd love to dig in a little bit more also to his stance toward the Soviet Union and the Bolsheviks. So, something that you wrote in your book was that you said that basically for the last 2 decades of his life, Kautsky served as the main social democratic attack dog against Bolshevism. And you described that he kind of held these beliefs that the Soviet Union was neither socialist nor capitalist, but a worse third thing, basically. Like it was something that was even more oppressive than bourgeois democracy. And I think you even write that he felt that fascism was basically a copy of Bolshevism. Can you talk a little bit more about this, like why he held these stances toward Bolshevism and if that manifested in anything else he did at the time?
Yeah, so Kautsky, when the Russian Revolution happens, the February one, I might add, is he thinks, oh, it's good that the workers have overthrown the czar. They should fight for a democracy and, some transformative reforms. And sometime in the future, they can have socialism. So that's his basic approach to it. Now, when the Bolsheviks take power and say, we will, as Lenin says, we will now construct the socialist order, he thinks this is an abomination. This would be like if, since he's the Pope of Marxism, this is like the devil to him. It's the devil taking power. And what's devilish about Bolshevism in his eyes? Remember, he thinks things are very evolutionary. You have feudalism, you have capitalism, then you have socialism. Well, Russia clearly doesn't have capitalism, so it hasn't had its bourgeois revolution. So this is wrong. Goes against every canon of history as he understands it, every conception of Marxism. So he thinks it's horrible. He thinks they're creating a slave state that, when they disperse the Constituent Assembly, which is filled with all these liberals and, reformists, he thinks it's the worst thing. If they had not done that, they would have avoided civil war. He doesn't like things like revolutionary terror. And he really thinks, they should just have parliamentarism. So he thinks it's like the worst abomination of Marxism. And it leads him to write a series of polemics shortly after the Russian Revolution. There's the dictatorship of the proletariat, and there's terrorism and communism. And to give you an idea of how important these polemics are, is they are responded to by Lenin and Trotsky, who are at this time basically leading the Soviet state in a civil war. They take time out of that to respond to Kautsky with polemics of their own, defending Bolshevism, defending Soviet power and workers' dictatorship and all of that. Because Kautsky is a huge theorist, so they feel the need to it. And I should add, other Bolshevik leaders also respond to Kautsky. There's Karl Radek, Nikolai Bukharin, and he basically sees the Bolshevik state, and it kind of shifts with him, actually, as on the one hand, it's state capitalist sometimes, other times it's more bureaucratic collectivists, and it's ruled by, this commissar, terrorist state, like class, and everyone is a slave, and he's basically also Chicken Little. He thinks like any minor crisis is going to bring down the Soviet Republic. And I should add, after Lenin and Trotsky basically stopped responding to him because they're doing other things, he continues to do this for the next 20-something years. So his idea of what the class character of Bolshevism is and the Soviet Union changes a bit. And it's a little unclear, but I mean, in certain respects, he prefigures people on the German conservative right in the 1980s who thought that the Soviet Union was worse than Nazi Germany. People like Ernst Nolte and everything. Because at one point in 1924, he says that the fascists are aping the Bolsheviks, which is what Nolte said. And he thinks Bolshevism was worse than Mussolini and Miklos Horthy, who was the far-right dictator in Hungary. And after the Nazis come to power, he actually thinks the greatest threat to the working class isn't Hitler, it's the Soviet Union. So for him, he's really prefiguring a lot of Cold War anti-communism with what he's doing. And he does it with a Marxist gloss. Because throughout his life, he always maintained that he is the orthodox Marxist, that he is the true follower of Marx and Engels. So throughout his, the last 20 years, he is in his polemics, he sees communists, Bolsheviks, and I should add, this is any type of person who looks to the Soviet Union, Stalinists, Trotskyists, whomever. he thinks they're the worst enemies. And he's basically taking the side of like this very bourgeois liberalism and, bourgeois democracy. And they're basically become idols to him. I think the most sacred thing for this Pope is a parliament. You can't have socialism, but God forbid someone does something without 50% plus 1% of the vote. For him, it's like sacrilegious. And, the Soviets, at one point he says they're kind of interesting, but no, it's parliament we should be concerned about. And in fact, in his polemics against the Bolsheviks, he actually interprets the Paris Commune as basically a bourgeois parliament, something that Lenin and Trotsky, basically rightfully call him out upon. But yeah, so he basically represents an early, or actually maybe the first form of fully developed of like a anti-communist, anti-Bolshevik Marxism that is attacking the Soviet Union and Bolshevism.
I'm kind of curious, because that's an interesting way to put it, that he kind of prefigures right-wing anti-communism. Was he very out of step among the SPD for these beliefs? Like, could we say that this is a point where he really starts to lose his influence on the left and kind of loses his stature as the Pope of Marxism? Or was he very convincing to people in the SPD of, able to convince them of the negativity of Bolshevism?
That's a very interesting question, because there's a number of factors that basically cause Kautsky's star to eclipse. The big one is World War I, because on the one hand, the revolutionary left hates him because he's basically covering for their support of the war. But on the other hand, he has his own criticisms of the war, which kind of makes him not really popular with like the real hardcore gung-ho members of the SPD apparatus. And his criticism becomes so much, he actually leaves the party in 1917 to join a group called the Independent Social Democratic Party. And he writes the program in that, but, he kind of is like in this nebulous middle, because on the one hand, things are like the contradictions in Germany are heating up. The social democratic right is identified with the government and the war, and the revolutionary left is identified with Bolshevism and the anti-war effort, and he's caught in the middle. And he basically is ignored when, in 1918, when the Kaiser flees and there's a revolution in Germany, and there's basically a state of semi-civil war with communists are fighting the government, workers, are forming Soviets and councils, and he comes up with his own plans to kind of bring everyone together in his good centrist compromise. And at this point, no one buys it. It's just he's ignored because he criticizes the right and the government, but it's mostly just so he can also criticize more harshly the far left. And eventually his party, the Independents, the majority of them join the communists, and he's part of a rump group that eventually rejoins the Social Democrats in the early 20s. And he's welcomed back. He writes the new program, but his influence isn't the same because of, the upheavals and whatnot. So communism and the Soviet Union is certainly part of why he lost like a lot of his prestige, but it's not the only part. It's like the heightened situation in Germany. Even though the SPD is still nominally Marxist, because they don't actually have a revolutionary left anymore, because they are anti-communist. It was the Social Democrats who murdered Luxemburg and Liebknecht. They were, crushing revolution in Germany. Kautsky really didn't have to convince them on any of that. They don't really need his compromises of we're going to have socialism and communism in the future, because they're not placating anyone in their ranks anymore. They're all in the Communist Party or somewhere else. So Kautsky's there. He kind of keeps it up, but his influence really isn't the same. And by this point, he's also he's in his 70s. So he eventually actually moves to Austria, and he writes, he's, still active, but he's not really taking a major role in a lot of the party stuff. So I think in a certain sense, you're right that the Bolshevik Revolution does cause Kautsky's star to plummet, but it's not the only thing. It's basically, to put it like this, is when the situation heats up, when the revolution is on the agenda and people demand answers, he can't provide them. And he basically blocks with like the right-wing bureaucrats who they might see him as kind of this, Marxist cover for their politics, but they really don't need it anymore by the time you have like World War One and like the Weimar Republic.
Yeah, he can provide answers, and also, as you point out, there are several events that really leave him blindsided, like things like the Great Depression and things like that.
Yeah, his views on the Depression were, or actually more specifically, Nazism was very. This may sound strange coming from me, but it's like I really would have given him maybe more credit before I wrote the book, because his view was basically the Nazis are coming to, they're gaining influence. And he basically says, well, we can't unite with the communists, obviously. So what are we going to do to fight the Nazis? Well, we're going to keep voting for the Social Democrats. And because we do that, we'll, the policy of lesser evilism that the Social Democrats followed, it helped save Germany, even though it didn't, because the Social Democrats supported Paul von Hindenburg, who we might add was the lesser evil in 1932. And what did he do when he became chancellor? When he became president? Well, he appointed Hitler to the position of chancellor. So the social democratic policy of lesser evilism didn't work. In fact, it led to Adolf Hitler. And what was his response to the rise of Hitler? It was really basically like, well, we did everything we could. And if we had actually done like a Bolshevik revolution in 1918, well, that would have been worse for Germany. And it's like, dude, really? That's your response to fascism? Yeah. We shouldn't have had communism? I mean, it's really, shows the blinders that was on this guy. He really couldn't conceive of anything except voting harder. I sometimes use that as a joke for U.S. liberals and social democrats, but that was literally what he wanted to do. Vote with more force for the social democrats who are going to support the lesser evil, who will bring in Adolf Hitler, and he'll just throw up his arms like that's it. And it really kind of shows you that a social democrat, a reformist, even one who is as intelligent as Karl Kautsky, those politics blinded him so much that was his only answer to the greatest crisis in German history that he really couldn't actually self-reflect on in any meaningful way.
Yeah, what you just said really nicely foreshadows where we will take this conversation in terms of like its application to the present day. I do also want to hear a little bit about Karl Kautsky's contemporaries, which you've kind of already mentioned in passing throughout this conversation. So Leon Trotsky did outlive Karl Kautsky, but even though Rosa Luxemburg and Vladimir Lenin did not outlive him, they did actually have their criticisms while they were alive. So what did some of these really prominent critics of Kautsky say about him?
So before I get to those three, who are the most important, he was criticized by a number of people, both inside and outside the SPD. So there was Anton Pannekoek, sometimes, Anton Pancakes. He was a Dutch Marxist, and he criticized Kautsky for basically fetishizing parliamentary struggle, not challenging the state. There was Franz Mehring, who also criticized Kautsky's defense of parliament. Karl Liebknecht, who basically wanted to engage in outright anti-militarist and anti-imperialist propaganda, particularly in the German army and youth. And they all criticized Kautsky and those politics. But I think what makes Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky the most important is not just because they repeat a lot of those points, but because together, the three of them have a comprehensive alternative system to Kautsky. Luxemburg's, criticisms of reformism, its material roots in like the labor bureaucracy and everything, along with, her criticisms of like German social democracy during World War I and the revolution is so incredibly important. The fact that she actually advocates mass strike and mass action as opposed to just gradually building up your forces. Lenin's conception of the party, imperialism, the state, political strategy, the idea of the party as like a tribune of the people and a vanguard as opposed to just a vote-catching organization. This is so much of a clash with Kautsky, and the fact that he tries to generalize that through like the Bolshevik Revolution and the Communist International to spread those politics in opposition to Kautsky. And Trotsky as well, with permanent revolution, with transitional demands, with his criticisms of centrism. I could go on, but the long and short of it is those three are what I call the three-legged stool. You need them all for the stool to stand up because they provide a comprehensive theory and practice on everything from economics, so Lenin's imperialism, philosophy, the rediscovery of Hegel and the dialectic, to understandings of the state and the party. And it really, there was one Marxist writer, I can't remember who off the top of my head, who said the Bolshevik Revolution was basically like the Reformation of Marxism. Again, we're using the religious analogies for the Pope here. And the Reformation, in a sense, to secularize it a bit, it's not just returning Marxism to its roots. It is doing that. But it's developing and refining these new concepts that you have from Lenin, from Luxemburg, and Trotsky. Because some of those are implied in Marx, but some of them are clearly new developments. And there's a reason like why we can speak, especially after 1917, of things like Leninism. Not just Lenin's ideas, but a whole new system, a development upon Marx that's faithful to it, but is developing it further and giving us more refined and sharper tools for the revolution. That obviously Luxemburg and Trotsky's contributions add to that as well. And Kautsky is an alternative to that. So the point I would just make is, if you're looking for alternatives to Kautsky, those three provide the most sustained and important criticism. They're not the only ones. There are people before them who have their criticisms of Kautsky, and they shouldn't be ignored. But I think if we're looking for like what is the best, what is the most comprehensive, it's those three I would look to.
By the end of his life, you mentioned earlier that Kautsky's star sort of starts fading, he loses influence, and in the decades after his death, certainly he becomes relatively more obscure. But then there was a sort of scholarly revival of interest in Kautsky, which kind of gets to his relevance today and why we still talk about him. So what did these scholars like Lars Lee, argue about Kautsky, and in what way was he rehabilitated in this period?
That's a great question. And I think to start off is we have to look at what Lee is responding to. So this is actually also in my book, Dialectics of Saturn, is during the Cold War, there was a very specific view of Bolshevism and the Soviet Union and Lenin specifically. And to make it very simple, is Lenin was this proto-totalitarian. His whole idea of the party was to manipulate and control the masses. He thought the workers were stupid and they needed to be controlled. And he basically was out for power. So Lenin was this basically Stalin before Stalin. And this is propagated by all like the major Cold War historians, particularly after 1945. People like Adam Ulam, Richard Pipes. You can go down the list of those figures. So this is the dominant view. And it still is in many circles, but it has been challenged. And it was challenged by people like Neil Harding, by Hal Draper, Moira Donald, and Marcel Liebman. And these people are all different. And particularly with Neil Harding, he's basically like, Lenin's not a totalitarian. He's an orthodox Marxist who believes that the workers can emancipate themselves and the party was meant to organize and, to lead them. But he wasn't this proto-totalitarian. And Lars Lee is basically, to finally get to your question, is picking up the baton of that. And he's basically saying, as part of this, is Lenin not only was not a proto-totalitarian, and this is something we should agree with Lars Lee about, I should add, is he's getting a lot of these conceptions of the party and his politics from Karl Kautsky. Now, Neil Harding and Hal Draper had kind of implied this and said it to a certain degree, but no one did it with as much force as Lars Lee. And what Lars Lee did in his book, Lenin Rediscovered, he does it in other books, of course, as well, He's basically like, there is no such thing as Leninism as a distinct current. It's basically Kautskyism applied to Russia. And Lenin is basically, he's more Catholic than the Pope. That throughout his life, Lenin doesn't really have original ideas on the party, imperialism, philosophy, and anything. He's basically copying Kautsky. So, in a sense, what Lars Lee does is, in defending Lenin, he's basically saying, well, Lenin's really not the important guy here. It's the guy that Lenin is inheriting, is taking stuff from, which is Kautsky. And this leads to a very interesting development in Lee's thinking. Basically, he erases Lenin's contributions on imperialism, on the Soviets, on the nature of the Russian Revolution, on philosophy. And I should add, the philosophy one, aside from the party, for me anyway, is one of the more egregious ones, because he actually writes on that subject. Because during World War I, Lenin is reading Hegel, and I can't emphasize how important that is to his thinking. And Lee is discussing this, but he actually says, I really don't have any philosophy training or anything, so I really can't talk about the specifics. And part of me is thinking, and forgive the Mao quote here, but no investigation, no right to speak. If you don't actually understand that, why are you talking about it? Why are you writing about it? So all of that together is basically largely of erasing Lenin's specific contributions and bringing Kautsky into the mix. Now, having said all that, I just want to say about Lars Lee does perform a useful purpose in his book, Lenin Rediscovered, because he gives a lot of the context of when Lenin is writing What is to be Done, his famous theoretical work in the early 1900s. He gives a lot of historical context, and it's very useful in that sense. Now, again, he's not the only person who's saying Lenin is not this proto-totalitarian, but he is doing it very forcefully. So there's useful in the book. The problem is when he keeps extending this further, and he refuses, I think, to look at the breaks Lenin makes in theory and practice with Kautsky in the 1905 revolution and World War I in 1917. We could obviously go down the list of all those events. The other thing he does is he looks at Lenin and Kautsky in a very surface level way. So to give you an example, if Lenin uses a particular phrase or expression, and if he finds the same one in Kautsky, he finds the link there, they're the same. I'm simplifying it a bit, but not too much. And the reason why this is a problem is, yes, that's a useful tool, absolutely. And it has, we shouldn't deny that. But how do those things play out in practice? Because what Lenin means by the party, both in theory and practice, and Lenin develops his idea of the party as time goes on, it means something very different. They're mobilizing workers against the Tsar in World War I in 1905 and in the 1917 revolutions. What's the Kautskyite party doing? Well, they're mobilizing German workers to fight for the Kaiser and die in trenches. That's a lot different, and one's a parliamentary party and one wants to smash parliament. These are very different conceptions of the party. And the long and short of it on this point is just to say that I can use this method of Lee's to basically look at, say, Lenin's words and say the words of the Communist Party USA or the Communist Party of China, who will use leftist-sounding language and just say they're the same. I don't really think the Communist Party of China, aside from some lingering lingo, has much to do with Lenin in practice. And I think we could say the same thing about Lenin's and Kautsky. Yes, they may use a lot of the same language, but in practice and in theory in a lot of places, it means very different things. And the last point I'll make, and I know this is a long answer, is yes, it's true that Lenin is getting a lot of his influence from Kautsky. That's undeniable. Lenin himself admits that. But if you read Lenin, he's getting influence from people like Plekhanov. In fact, Lenin, who breaks with Plekhanov later in life, says, even then, he's like, you can't be a communist if you haven't read Plekhanov. And if you read Lenin's writings on imperialism, it's drawing from Bukharin and Hilferding, among others. So it's like Kautsky's important to Lenin, but he isn't the only influence. And we would do a disservice to Lenin if we not only ignore his other influences, but his own distinctive contributions that he gets out of that raw material. So again, Lee is a complicated figure in a sense because he defends Lenin sort of to a point, but ultimately his project is to bury Lenin, at least as an academic, because he's really not a political activist.
In your book, you describe Lars Lee in a very instructive way in terms of his influence. So you wrote, Lee acts as a halfway house when it comes to the reemergence of Kautskyism among present-day democratic socialists. So that kind of brings me to, I mean, you were just saying that Lars Lee apparently is not very politically affiliated. He's more in the academic realm. How have reformist socialists, though, people like, for example, Eric Blanc or Jacobin founder Bhaskar Sunkara and other people, used Kautsky's legacy? Or to make the question even a little bit more explicit, what is the real purpose behind rehabilitating Kautsky for these sectors of the left?
So yeah, to start with Lee, just to finish up, is he was active a bit in the 70s. He was involved in the early iterations of like the Democratic Socialists of America when they were DASOC, but he mostly does academic stuff. And I want to clarify, I don't actually think he has some kind of malicious political intent. I really just think he's an academic. That's what he does. He really doesn't want to do it beyond like his academic interests. Okay, whatever. Well, basically, he provides the academic or theoretical rationale for people like Eric Blanc and Jacobin. So, to get it out of academia for a little bit, you have in the period, after the 2008 crash, you have the formation of Jacobin magazine, which really takes off around 2015 or so. And Sankara, who's the founder, he has a lot of influences. They're mostly other reformists, Michael Harrington, who I also don't like, Ralph Miliband, Eric Olin Wright, and Kautsky. And he basically, wants to have develop a, reformist socialist program. And the vehicle for this becomes the Democratic Socialists of America, particularly as it develops and gets more members after the Bernie Sanders 2016 presidential campaign. Because they're fairly small beforehand, and they have they've have like in the tens of thousands. I know the membership has fluctuated lately, so I don't know the current figures. And so there's now kind of a space to talk about these reformist politics. And it does continue to happen in Jacobin, but there are people within the Democratic Socialists of America, some caucuses. And Eric Blanc, who was on the far left beforehand, but is now in DSA in one of their caucuses, and he's a labor professor at Rutgers, he's kind of using Kautsky to develop a program for democratic socialism in America. And why Kautsky? I think there's a number of reasons for that. The first is, if Blanc was in, say, a communist party, and most of the communist parties are not revolutionaries, advocating those same politics, is he'd probably be relying on someone like Grigory Dimitrov, Plamero Tagalati, or Earl Browder, who are kind of these reformist figures within the Comintern. But they're all tainted to varying degrees with Stalinism. So they can't use them. On the other hand, they don't really want to use Harrington, because Harrington, at least in the open, a lot of them don't like to use him, even if in practice they kind of are like him. Kautsky is this interesting other case because he's not a Stalinist and he's not a communist, but he's also has the mantle of orthodox Marxism to back up a lot of these reformist politics that he's advocating. So he becomes kind of this stand-in. And what Eric Blanc does, and he has this reading of the Russian Revolution that's largely based on Lars Lee, is he basically thinks, well, Leninism was just Russian specific, and it's a misreading of what happened in 1917. And, Karl Kautsky got it right. So we should just apply Kautsky to the United States. And what does that mean? Well, it means getting a parliamentary majority for socialism and passing a bunch of reforms. And interestingly, he says that this strategy was proven to be a success in Finland in 1917, 1918, which is very funny if you actually know the history of Finland in 1917, 1918. And it's true the Social Democrats got a parliamentary majority. But it's also true that they basically were a roadblock to the workers who were fighting for Soviets, for revolution, and had power foisted upon them. And they provided misleadership in a civil war that they were not prepared to fight, while the other side was armed to the teeth and basically massacred them. And if that's your example of success, I really want to know what failure looks like. I really do. Now, to also take what Blanc is saying is, so having a parliamentary majority, he's obviously engaging in like a lot of anti-communist stereotypes on Leninists as not fighting for reforms or like not liking the people and this kind of stuff. So there's that level of it. And interestingly, in some of his debates, which gets a little complicated, he basically uses Rosa Luxemburg as like his stand-in for like Bolshevism. But from his reading of Kautsky, he develops this strategy for how to get to his reforms. So I'll kind of break it down a bit. And it's basically, well, we need a socialist party in the US. We don't have one. How do we get one? Well, Blanc initially says we need a labor party and everything. And eventually he says, well, you know what? Reformist politicians who are working inside the Democratic Party, these kind of insurgent candidates, like Bernie Sanders, AOC, etc., they will galvanize mass movements of people. And he says they did this in the teachers' strike, or at least he says Sanders did it in like 2018 or so, which isn't true, but that's his reading. Basically, he says, we will support these insurgent candidates in the Democratic Party, build up our power, our organizational base, and eventually, when we are strong enough, we will break away from them. And he calls this strategy the dirty break. And I go into this in excruciating detail in the book about how it kind of starts off as like his whole strategy is like very, orthodox Marxist, and it devolves into not a dirty break, but a dirty stay. Because by the end of 2019, 20, he's basically, we're going to be spending decades in the Democratic Party, so we really can't break from them. So support Joe Biden because Trump is bad and all this kind of stuff. And it's really not different from something that Harrington would have said or the Communist Party does say at a point. And this is a side note, is I actually haven't seen anything from him on the 2024 election. So I don't actually know what his position is. I suspect it's still the dirty stay, but that's just a theory. So basically, he ends up using Kautsky to rationalize this very parliamentary, legalistic, gradualistic approach that ultimately doesn't get you reforms. It doesn't get you socialism. It doesn't get you a socialist party. It basically gets you supporting imperialism, war, and strike breaking, and all the bad things the Democrats do, including people like AOC and Bernie Sanders. And essentially, that to answer your question, Kautsky has kind of become this way to re-legitimize like an explicitly democratic socialist or reformist socialist politics in the United States. And that's essentially what Blanc, Sankara, and a lot of others in DSA have tried to do to greater or lesser degrees.
Yeah, mentioning AOC, Bernie Sanders, and these people, I think brings us to a nice close in this conversation about why you wrote this book now. So I want to ask, why is Kautsky and this topic so relevant today? And even more specifically, what are the lessons that we can draw from his life, his work, and his legacy?
Well, why I wrote the book, and I'll admit this was actually hard to write at certain points, and I want to give thanks out to my good friend and comrade Harrison Fluss, who the book was originally his idea because he said, no one's really done a takedown of Lars Lee. You should do it. And stupidly or not, I decided to do it because Kautsky is obviously a part of that. And the importance of Kautsky is when you look at an idea like democratic socialism as expressed in Jacobin or DSA, I find it's very useful for any idea that's like prominent is to go back to its sources, the most articulate expression for it. And Kautsky, whether we like him or not, he was a very intelligent man. And he really developed these ideas on how you would transition to socialism democratically and everything. And he had a whole theoretical and practical rationale. And in that sense, it was so incredibly useful to go back because you really get to see in all its nuance and details, the first person who did it. Again, to use our biblical analogy, he's our Adam. We're all the way back there. He's our Moses, and whatnot. He's delivering the commandments. And Kautsky is important because a lot of reformist socialists, not just in the US, but in Eurocommunism, in Chile, whether they acknowledge it or not, they're all drawing from Kautsky to develop these strategies. And you see it also in Syriza, Dalinka, and others, even if, again, a lot of it's unacknowledged, but when like reformist theorists, they try and actually articulate it, they turn to Kautsky, for the most part. And they develop these whole apparatuses theoretically and practically. And I think it's important to go back to that because, to put it very bluntly, Kautsky's theories were wrong in his time, and they were wrong now. They led the Social Democrats in Germany to disaster and betrayal. They betrayed the working class in 1914 and 1919, and he rationalized that. He supported it. And the other experiments after Salvador Allende, the various neo-reformist parties in Europe like Syriza, and DSA, which isn't even a party, are following like a lot of these same politics. They don't get you to socialism, and they depend on misreading history, on an anti-dialectical view of the past, of philosophy, of politics that basically end up making you subordinated to the bourgeoisie and dragging the name of socialism through the mud. So I think if we want to actually have a revolution, if we want to have communism now, fight for it, then we should look at someone like Kautsky to basically figure out what not to do and to expose it so we can defend our own worldview and develop a politics that is generally revolutionary, that was generally going to lead the working class to victory. And to the extent that Kautsky influences segments of the left in the US and internationally, it's worth looking at him. But it's also worth doing it so we can reject him. Because those politics will not get you to socialism and then not get you to communism, and they will end up in betrayal in one form or another. And I hope my book has done something to help arm people, to get people interested in genuine Marxism, genuine revolutionary politics. Because what Kautsky offers, particularly as his life goes on, is not revolution, it's not Marxism. And all the people who tried to revive him, Lars Lee, Eric Blanc, and Sankara, they do a disservice to the name of socialism and communism to Marxism. And we should reject that. And to put it kind of simply and almost in a cliche form, go back to Marx, go back to Lenin, Trotsky, Luxemburg, and all the rest, because they got it right, basically. And Kautsky got it wrong.
Yeah, I think you put it really eloquently in the book when you say about these reformists that, having this faith in elections, in institutions of capitalist and bourgeois democracy, this kind of makes it so that these people are really destined to find themselves in, as you put it, the same cul-de-sac as Kautsky himself.
Yeah, I think, if you look at all these reformists, they develop these strategies, and some of them are very sophisticated. If you look at Palancis or Blanc, they bring in history and theory. They're very intelligent people. Same with Kautsky. But what is it, to justify what they're doing, they basically, we can't have dialectics because that means like the system is going to break down. Capitalism can't sustain these reforms. So we can't do that. We have to have some kind of evolutionary approach. Well, we can't judge that our whole democratic road to socialism has been a failure, whether in Chile or Finland or somewhere else. So we basically got to rewrite history, to put it like that. And it really is dishonest at that level. And it's, Bolshevism, communism, even if it was just for a short while that they took power in 1917, and they were able to at least begin the construction of a better society, didn't last. But I'll tell you this, what they did in 1917, even for a short while, it was basically like running like 3/4 of a marathon before you had to tap out. What Kautskyism has meant in practice, all these kind of democratic socialist attempts, is not, running 3/4 of a marathon. You're not at the starting gate. you're in a different town over from the stadium. You're not even there. Because if you look at Chile, where they tried a peaceful road to socialism, it ends up with a military coup. If you look in Finland, it's a massacre and a civil war. And you have social democratic governments throughout Europe and elsewhere who the only thing they do in power is betray the workers and support imperialism. Or you look in the US where you have DSA supporting these imperialist politicians, in the Democratic Party. That's a dead end. That is a betrayal of socialism. And, maybe Kautsky couldn't quite see where it would end up to give the most generous interpretation. But we are more than 100 years after he developed a lot of these ideas, and we can damn well know where they're going to end up. And it is in a cul-de-sac. It isn't a dead end. And if we're serious about socialism and communism, it means rejecting Kautsky and Toto. At most, I'll say, like, some of Kautsky's historical works are, like, interesting to read. I really actually like the Christianity book. But anything he says about practical politics, you should just reject. And I hope the book does a good job of taking him seriously and explaining why that should all be rejected.
In the show notes, I will link to your previous works and books and also our previous interviews with you. I would love to hear, though, about your current projects. What are you working on now? What can we look forward to in the future?
Well, thank you for asking that. So a few months ago, I have two projects. And the first one I'll tell you about is a book I finished a few months ago. And it's basically looking at current day neo-Stalinists who are apologizing for the Moscow trial. So that's Domenico Lacerdo, Bill Bland, Ludo Martins, and Grover Furr. And basically dissecting them and why they're full of it. So it's also kind of like looking at their views as conspiracy theories. And I'm just looking for a publisher for that right now. That's all done. The other project I'm working on now, which is an incredibly huge project, I'm probably about 2/3 done with the first draft, it's basically doing what I did for Stalinism, but on the far right. And I'm basically looking at the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche and how it influences fascism, particularly in Italy, but elsewhere. And I can't, there's a lot of figures I'm looking at, obviously Mussolini, Gabriele D'Annunzio, a lot of other figures, Oswald Mosley. Put simply, Nietzsche is immediate and direct influence on Italian fascism. Mussolini was an avid reader of Nietzsche and put his ideas into practice, more or less. And a lot of other fascists are drawing from him. Unfortunately, I have to read like the worst people in the world to write this. So Mussolini is not fun to read.
No.
To put it like that. But on the other hand, it's really fascinating to look at all these connections that all like these right-wing thinkers are getting from Nietzsche. And it's kind of meant to push back at Nietzsche studies, which basically denies like the influence that Nietzsche has on fascism, to say it's being misread. It's misreading of him. It's not a misreading. I think the fascists were the most faithful followers of Friedrich Nietzsche, and I'm hoping I can prove it. So that's the other project, and hopefully that'll be done at least, by sometime next year. But that's the project I'm currently working on right now.
Thank you so much. Looking forward to speaking to you again in the future.
Thanks so much for having me.